Where does it hurt? Where does it hurt? I can't think of a more profound or empathetic or compassionate question. Where does it hurt? It's an invitation to be vulnerable, to be honest, to respond to another person's needs, and to respond to help that is being offered. It's asking permission to learn the secrets of a person's heart. It's recognition of our shared humanity and our need for one another. So where does it hurt? Where do you hurt this morning? From Mark 5, a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now, immediately aware that a power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in all around you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." How desperate this woman must have been. She spent all of her money, whatever social capita she once had, all of her time, all of her energy, all of her effort to get well, and it was all gone. She was empty. There was no more left. She had nothing after her 12-long-year quest to find healing. And she needed healing because her illness could not allow her to participate in her society the way she wanted. She was unclean. She was unclean. We don't really have many modern things that are comparable to this. She was unclean, which means she would have suffered from physical and social isolation from everyone she knew for 12 long years. Anything she touched, anything she ate off of, anything she sat on in any way could not be used by anyone else around her. Otherwise, they also would have been unclean. So imagine for a moment if you were unable to visit your children or your grandchildren or hug your spouse or go to a friend's house, anything at all, go to work for 12 years and be ostracized for something that you had absolutely no control over. And yet, despite her profound suffering, she proclaims the truth of what has happened to her, and somehow, through all of this, her dignity remains intact as she stands there and shares her pain with Jesus. Almost 20 years ago, which seems like a long time, but the older I get, it goes like that. Almost 20 years ago, I had cancer. Most of you know this. The treatment that I had at the time radiation therapy was given as one massive dose. And because it was so much at one time, it wasn't safe for me to be around anyone else. I couldn't be physically near another person. So it meant that I had to stay in isolation in the hospital for about a week. When I walked into this room, everything in the room was covered in plastic. The remote control, the handle on the toilet, all the doorknobs, the bed rails, everything that I could conceivably touch in the week that I was in this room was covered in plastic. The walls were lined with lead so that the radiation from my body did not leak out into the hallways. The nurses didn't come into my room. Now, some of y'all are nurses. You know that's weird. They would stand at the doorway, say, "Hey, how you doing? Doing okay? That's great." And then they would leave. They would not even enter my room. If I needed something, they would slide it on the floor or set it down right beside my door. And I was not allowed to get out of my bed to come get it until they had shut the door and left. The radiologist tech would come into my room every single day in a full hazmat suit from head to toe. And he had a Geiger counter. And you know what he would do with it? He would have me stand there and he would measure how much radiation I had and if it was safe enough for me to leave the hospital and be around other people. And each day until the last day, I couldn't leave. Everything I brought with me had to stay there and be disposed of by nuclear medicine. Any books, any magazines, my hairbrush, my toothbrush, my clothes, everything had to stay behind. And as we left, finally, as I was able to go home with my husband, I looked over my shoulder, and on the door was this massive sign that said, "Do not enter radioactive material." I was unclean. I was unclean. It had been a lonely week, but nothing compared to what was ahead. I still wasn't safe for others for any kind of long-term contact. I could be in my own home, but I still had to maintain some measure of separation from my family for a month. I could be in the same room, but I couldn't really sit close to them. Our oldest son, Noah, was 2, and he didn't understand what that meant. He didn't understand that it meant that I couldn't hold him for 30 days. I could not physically comfort my 2-year-old son. Even now, I get teary remembering how I could not hug him for 30 days. I was unclean for 30 long days. One day it all kind of really hit home. He was upset, he was crying, he was stomping his feet, he was having a tantrum because, 2-year-olds do that. And at one point he stopped and he lifted his arms up to me and he cried and he yelled and he pleaded, "Mama, hold. Mama, hold. Mama, hold. Mama, hold." And all I could do was stand there and pat him on the head and say, "I can't. I love you, but I can't." And with tears running down his face and tears running down mine, he looked at me like I had abandoned him. And in that moment, I felt I had. And I felt that God had abandoned me in the hallway of my own home. So I would have done anything. I would have paid any amount of money. I would have done whatever it took, any amount of energy, any amount of pleading, any amount of anything to be able to hold my son that day, to be clean enough to swoop him up off the floor and dry his tears with my kisses and hold him until he fell asleep in my arms. And instead, we looked at each other and cried, and 20 years later, it is the most devastating moment of motherhood for me. To have our basic needs met by someone who cares about us is such an important thing. It cannot be overstated how much we all need someone, somewhere who cares enough about us to help us heal from that which hurts us. When we're denied that healing, when we're denied that comfort, it compounds our pain into trauma that lasts years, never really fully going away. And often the pain revisits us time and time and time again, simply because we're unable to heal from the past, because we never had an opportunity to share it with anyone. This woman in our text this morning, she was grieving. She was lost. She was wounded. She was broken, and she was desperate. She was desperate for healing. It is astonishing. It is miraculous that she had enough within her, enough left, enough hope, enough faith, enough energy to believe that she could still find healing that she so desperately needed, that Jesus, she knew, could offer her. He was her last chance, her best hope. So many others would have given up by then. 12 years of abandonment, 12 years of isolation and grief. She must have been so weary. And yet she knew if she just reached out and touched a piece of his clothing, she would find the healing that she needed. Where does it hurt? When you ask your family member, your neighbor, your coworker, even somebody that you hardly know, where does it hurt? You are not only offering them the hem of Jesus' cloak, you are offering them the love of Jesus himself. That question is a gift that no one else may offer them, an opportunity, an invitation to share their story, their pain, their grief with you. It is an opportunity for you to not just bear witness to their pain, but to voluntarily share in it with them. Jesus could have just kept on walking because he was literally on his way somewhere else, somewhere incredibly important. But instead, he stopped what he was doing and he took the time to hear this woman's story. His compassion, his empathy, his love is what helped her heal. Here's the thing with inviting someone to share their story, their pain, their grief with us. We can be tempted to tell people what we would do in their situation. And let me tell you, there is a Grand Canyon-sized gulf between empathy and projection. Empathy is sitting with somebody in their pain, showing love, giving them your full attention, helping them know you are present with them. It's an incredible act of compassion to just sit with someone and listen. Now, chaplains fancy it up and call it ministry of presence, but Jesus just calls it love. That's all it is. But projection, that's something different. We tend to sneak into that whenever the opportunity offers itself. We tend to want to tell people arrogantly, or we think compassionately, what we would do in their shoes. Look, you might have the best advice on the planet, but don't nobody want to hear it. Nobody wants to hear it. You don't need to share it. Because the honest truth is, folks, you don't usually need us telling them what to do. They just need us to be with them and listen and love them. Hardly anybody ever wants advice. I mean, how often do you want to hear advice from somebody when you're in the middle of a mess? You don't. I don't. Don't you tell me what to do. That's what I'm thinking in my head. And that's okay. That's okay. If later on down the road they ask you, hey, what would you do in my situation? Then maybe, and that's still debatable, maybe you can share what you think. But in the moment that you're listening to them, just create sacred space for them to share their story. No judgment, no advice, just the gift of presence. It's enough to help them when they need it most. It is exactly, precisely what Jesus did. He offered them himself. Jesus never said to the woman, hey, you shouldn't have gone to that doctor, or you shouldn't have tried that cure, or hey, have you heard of this? Have you thought about trying this? He just creates space for her to share what she needs, for her to share her hurt. He affirms her personhood, and he loves her into healing. The problem with this sort of ministry, this way of loving folks, is that we are confronted with the knowledge that we can't fix anything. That's why we have trouble listening in the first place. That's why we're so quick to push our own advice, because we know we can't fix it, and we want to, because knowing that we can't makes us feel helpless and sad and angry and frustrated. And when we sit with someone in their hurt, in their pain, we open our heart to them and their pain too, and it becomes part of us, and we don't know what to do with that. And so we just want to make it go away, and we want to fix it for them and for us. I read this week that what Jesus offered this woman by listening to her is the knowledge that her pain is not shameful. Y'all need to hear that again, because I had to read that like 10 times. Pain is not shameful. Their pain, your pain, is not shameful. So often that is entangled. Shame and pain is just twisted up in one big knot. Well, friends, it is time to untangle it and find the healing that we and others seek by simply asking the question, where does it hurt? And then listening to the answer as we help them let go of the shame that is all tangled up with all of that pain, because there is nothing absolutely nothing shameful in looking for healing. There is nothing to be ashamed about in trying to find your way back after you have lost your way. And there is absolutely nothing shameful about trying to put the pieces back together after you have felt broken. Nothing shameful about that. There's nothing wrong with taking someone up on their offer to hear your story of where it hurts either. We have all been there, and you know what? So has Jesus. That vulnerability is an important part of our faith, and it is a necessary part of our healing. Whether we're the one sharing our story, whether we're the one hearing someone else's story, through that expression of vulnerability, we find our compassion that is our strength as a people of faith. And that compassion leads to empathy, and empathy leads to love, and love, my dear friends, love is what helps us heal. Amen. Let us join together in our pastoral prayer this morning. Creator God, you have created the earth whole and round. You created us to be whole people, but in some ways we have become broken, fragmented, and cracked by false promises and lost relationships and shattered trust. We have been cracked with the experience of systemic sin and prejudice and oppression and fear. We have become fragmented, building up walls instead of loving and helping one another. We have been hurt by things that we cannot control, and even sometimes by decisions and actions we have taken. Forgive us, God, when we have done the breaking, and heal us when we have been hurt. Be with all this morning who are lifting their arms up to you, saying, hold me, hold me. Let your light shine through our cracks and scars so that we might bring light to the world, showing that in you we are made whole. In you we find healing. In your compassion and empathy we find love, and that love can heal the world, the physical, mental, and spiritual healing that we all need. In you, God, we find renewed life. Help us to forgive, to love, and to mend with one another. Amen.